I guess you kind of touched on this was, women accessing capital, and obviously the startup ecosystem and the capital that we have available in Australia is generally at the moment not as good as it was. But we know that women accessing, or getting 2% of that. And when I've told people that aren't in the startup kind of ecosystem, they are shocked. And it's not actually, even though I think in our world it's very common knowledge because, we're advocates for it and there are people speaking about it, which is great, especially yourself. What do you think, what will be your advice to female founders to try and, I guess, combat this problem? Or, there's honestly so much you can do, but is there anything that you found has worked for you or other female founders?
Look, they could always try like a sex change, particularly if they're Caucasian, become white men. That might get them funding sooner. Truthfully, it is. It's not an answer I have, because it's. You'll hear all of these motivational speeches, which is like, if you're just getting no's, you're just speaking to the wrong person. And I say this now off the back of over. So I started my pre-seed in 2022. That closed just before April. And then from July to January, I was trying to close the seed round, and it came together over a month, just past. And, I sit here and I'm like, it's the just sheer luck that this came together, and the fact that I had to go through hundreds of investors. Hundreds in terms of who I was talking to, the meetings I had to have. It was just so draining because how much it was taking away from the actual work I can do for FemTech, because I was so consumed with needing to do this. I don't know if I have any practical advice for that, because my lived experience of it has just been sheer grit and having my face against a meat grinder and continuing on and on and on. And that's really crappy and unfortunate. But in that same breath, not unfortunate because we've managed to close around. Absolutely. And it's like, if you speak to the majority of female founders, address problems from those sorts of pain points.
Yeah.
Because of lived experiences, because they understand the problem space. They want to improve society. They want to improve the current solutions that are out there. There's a lot of amazing female founders out there at the moment, and what they're doing in terms of like the products they're creating and what they're trying to do is just absolutely phenomenal. I'm one of, not saying I'm phenomenal or amazing, but I'm just one of many female founders who is really tied to a problem space, yourself included. It was actually one of the conversations we had, God, it would have been months ago now, but we were talking about voice recognition. And I didn't realize that all voice recognition, I don't know why, because I know everything is built on men, but you said that voice recognition is built on men as well. And I was like, oh, this is why auto dictate never works for me. I've been laughing about it for a hot minute, but we're currently in this society where I can't say that my fingers hurt if I close them in a door, because people will say, have you got research to prove that? Have you got a study to prove that? So we're currently in a society which is just so driven by research and studies, and uses that to really back up, dogmatic views. They cherry pick what they want with it as well. So having this data and having it in the future, available to actually prove what we're saying and create our own research, I'm so excited for that. I really, really am.
And, you're feeding it back into the gender health gap. With the latest McKinsey report, we know if we start closing this gap, we start, potentially giving full-time jobs to 137 million women by 2040, because we improve their understanding and access to healthcare. Diagnostics treatments are better for women. Therefore, they're not missing out on as much work during their working years, and they can afford to look after their families and contribute more to the economy. And I think it's just such important work, which hopefully Ovum will contribute to in other ways, and just filling this longitudinal data gap, and all these amazing women founders coming up with new technologies and ways of capturing this data.
But it's just so fascinating to look at that sort of data in terms of what we know, which is just so gross to say, but what we know in terms of women training with their cycles is that there was a systematic review, and the researchers basically took all of this other crappy research that had been done really poorly
Mm.
and then did a review and said any women who feel the effects of their menstrual cycle and how it impacts training, it's basically a psychosomatic response. And it's just like, oh, isn't that lovely? You know, women being told again that it's in our head. You know, we can't possibly be dictated by the cyclical changes to our hormones, where we know that we have estrogen receptors all throughout our body. We know the profound impact of progesterone on our body. It's very painful. And I think this is the problem as well, right? You Google hierarchy of research, and systematic reviews are pretty high up there in terms of how much we respect them. And then people grab onto this and they're like, oh no, there's no differences. You know, cycle syncing is out. There's no way that could impact your training performance. And it's like, well, I beg to differ, because first of all, of my own lived experiences, where I can assure you it's not in my head, and all of the experiences of the women I've worked with, and now the data that we're going to be able to really get through and prove that women actually, their performance changes through it's wild. It's absolutely wild, the world we're living in. But what has been most interesting to me is that obviously our user profiles, when they set up their account, all of it is de-identified. And we have quite specific user profiles in terms of life stage. So whether they're in their menstruating years, perimenopausal, what hormonal conditions they may have. And what we've actually found is that women who have PCOS are most frequently logging that their most common mood is stress. And women who have no hormonal conditions, the mood they're most frequently logging is happiness. Their treatment approach from Western Med and their doctors was just to be given the pill.
Yeah.
It was that's it, you know. Deal with this. If you want to have babies, you can come off the pill, which is just such a lazy, irresponsible way to manage someone's health. Yeah, basically accept the card you've been dealt. Here is something that can mask the symptoms well enough. And yeah, so, you know, there was all these women that I was working with who didn't want to be on the pill, had negative side effects to being on the pill, wanted answers for what was going on with them, weren't able to get them with the practitioners they had been working with. And that was really what started to drive a lot of this further research, where it was like, how can I help these women? They were quite young women. You know, majority of them were in their 20s, early 20s to mid 20s. And it just felt so wrong that, you know, these women were so young and had so many issues. It just didn't sit right with me at all. So that's really where it came from and what spurred it on.
Yeah, and there's definitely an epidemic and a rise. I mean, even a lot of the women I've spoken to in, you know, the surveys I've been doing with Ovum, a lot of the younger girls that are dealing with a lot of these diseases that you mentioned or conditions that either the later generation were never allowed to speak about or made aware of, and now younger women finally speaking out and saying, actually, that's not good enough, and this is what I'm going through, and there's actually been an investigation inquiry into it. Or there's something else going on and we haven't gotten to it and we need more data, which just feeds back into the gender health gap, which we're both trying to address.